Today at the National Press Club, Israeli historian Ilan Pappe. He's a professor at the University of Exeter's College of Social Sciences and International Studies in the United Kingdom. Professor Pappe has written a number of controversial books about the creation of Israel. From the National Press Club in Canberra, Ilan Pappe.
On behalf of the National Press Club, welcome to the National Gallery of Australia for today's National Australia Bank Address. Our guest today is one of what is referred to as Israel's new historians, those academics who have been rewriting the history of the Jewish nation following the release of official British and Israeli documents back in the 1980s. To some, he represents a voice of reason. He's someone who supports the creation of a single state for Palestinians and Israelis and who has, in their view, accurately captured the circumstances surrounding the expulsion of nearly 750,000 Palestinians after Israel's creation in 1948. To others, though, particularly in his own homeland, his portrayal of that expulsion as the ethnic cleansing of Palestine amounts to historical heresy and is clearly roundly rejected and considered highly offensive. He now works in the UK, although he lives between the UK and Israel. He lectures at the University of Exeter after he was forced to really leave Israel, in his own words, because it was increasingly difficult to live and work in his homeland because of his unwelcome views and convictions. Professor Pappe is in Australia as a guest of the Australian Friends of Palestine Association. He's here to deliver the annual Edward Said address in Adelaide. Edward Said was a prominent Palestinian who lived and worked most of his life in the US, a prominent Palestinian intellectual. And he's also opening the festival of what is called Dangerous Ideas at the Sydney Opera House this coming Sunday. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Ilan Pappe.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Press Club for inviting me and to thank you all for coming and listening and discussing an issue which is very dear to my heart and I hope to many of you who are present here today. I am a professor of history and I cannot resist but giving a history lesson when I see people sitting either next to tables or especially in rows. And I hope you will indulge with me for taking you back in time, but not just for the sake of historical curiosity, but to give you an exposure in the brief time that I have for the kind of historical perspective that I have on the history of Israel and Palestine. Because I think that much of what happens today and a lot of issues which are connected to the future solution of the conflict in Israel and Palestine is connected to the history of the place. And more importantly, to the way that history is understood, articulated, and engaged with. Quite a lot of peace mediators, especially Americans, who were involved in trying to bring peace to the Middle East in general and to the Arab-Israeli conflict in particular, used to think that any indulgence in past events is an obstacle for peace. Not surprisingly, that perspective was always welcomed by the Israelis and negated by the Palestinians. Of course, the Israelis wanted everyone to be engaged with an ancient past, what happened 2,000 years ago, but not what happened 60 years ago. And the Palestinians, the other way around. They thought that the last 100 years were far more important for understanding what is at stake in Israel and Palestine, and what happened 2,000 years was just sheer propaganda that had no relevance to the reality on the ground. Now, with this, at least recognition of the importance of the historical narrative for understanding better the present reality and the prospects for a much better future, I thought that the best way of doing it is to point out to several mythologies which in my own state are regarded almost as sacred historical facts. and which I, to the great displeasure of my family, decided to debunk and challenge. And I would enumerate some of these foundational mythologies, put across my own understanding of that mythologies based on my professional research, and hopefully we'll have enough time to conclude with some reasonable analysis of what the new perspective on history tells us about the present and the chances for a future solution in Israel and Palestine. A very famous mythology in Israel is that Palestine was a land without people, waiting for people without land. I'm sure that doesn't sound too unfamiliar to people in this country. And it took a while for me and others to try and convince the Israeli academic community. It was much easier to convince the more global academic community that Palestine was not an empty land when the first Zionist settler arrived there in the late 19th century. When they arrived in Palestine, the Palestinians were already enjoying a thriving cultural, social, and economic life. They were not yet defined as Palestinians, that is true. Nobody was defined in national terms in the late 19th century. There were, it is also true, citizens or inhabitants of the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but nonetheless they already had their own characteristic as a nation, and had Zionism not arrived in Palestine, they would have become just another Arab national movement like the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Moroccan, and the Algerians. Jews may have felt that there were people without land. This is also questionable, but I won't go into that. But at least one cannot say that they arrived at an empty land. So that's one very important mythology. If you look at Israeli textbooks today in high schools, if you listen to the way history is narrated in official ceremonies, or how it appears in the discourse of politicians, surprisingly, this mythology still appears in a very forceful manner and is, to my mind, not very helpful for pushing forward the chances of peace and reconciliation in Israel and Palestine. The second mythology was that the Palestinians, from the very beginning, rejected the Zionist movement on religious grounds, were only employing violence against the attempts of Jews to save themselves from the horrors of Europe before and during the Holocaust. And more or less, as he's still alive, the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, you will excuse me for not being clear on that medical question. The way Ariel Sharon used to say, Palestinian terrorism started in 1882. I think this is a false description of the impulse of the Palestinian, both as a society and as a political leadership, towards the unexpected, vast immigration of Jews from Europe into their homeland. Palestinians, like most Arabs, are very hospitable people. And the initial reaction in the 1920s to the mass immigration of Jews, most of them very poor Jews, was to welcome them as poor people, allow them to be part of the society. What they did not accept was when it became clear, more or less in the late 1920s, that these settlers don't want to be guests, they want to be the owners of the house. And not just the owner of the house, they want to be the exclusive owners of the house. So yes, Palestinian resistance started there and then, but it was a very legitimate resistance against colonization of their own homeland. Not every act the Palestinians took was justified, not every political decision that they have made before the creation of the State of Israel was wise, but all in all, questioning the moral foundation of the Palestinian right to resist or to demand self-determination in their own homeland is, I think, wrong. The third point I would like to make is about the end of the mandatory period, the end of the British rule. Of course, that particular year, 1948, which ended the British rule in Israel and Palestine, is the most interesting year for an historian. Because for the Israelis, this is almost a miraculous year. This is the year when 2,000 years of Jewish exile have ended, and something incredible has happened when Jews could have their own homeland and build their own state. For Palestinians, there couldn't be a more catastrophic year. This is the year in which they have lost their homeland, their houses, their hopes to thrive as human beings and as a nation. Not very many junctures in history have such two striking historical understandings. And I belong to a group of Israeli historians who, until the Israelis made their archives accessible, were quite convinced that the Israeli Jewish perspective on this year was the correct one. But the Israelis' own archives show, actually, that the Palestinian catastrophe, or as the Palestinians call it, the Nakba, in which they lost half of their villages, half of their towns, and half of their country's population, that this was not a result, as Israeli mythology would put it, because of their foolishness, or because of the fact that they rejected a very reasonable solution produced by the United Nations to partition Palestine between the Jews and the Palestinians. I think what the Israeli documents show very clear, that regardless of any solution, the Zionist understanding of how to create a Jewish state was that if you want to survive, and far more so if you want to thrive and prosper, you need as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians in it as possible. And that realization that if you wanted to be a Jewish state and at the same time a democratic state, you could not allow yourself not to be the demographic majority. I always say to the Palestinians, you have been much better off if the Jews would have not dreamt about a democracy. Because they were so obsessed with the idea of democracy, they said, we cannot allow a state in which we are not the majority. But in 1948, the Jews were just 1/3 of the population. Now, I'm sure you can all think of all kinds of ways of how do you settle the problem that you want to be a majority in your own country, but you're only 1/3 majority. There are probably few ways of doing it. What the Zionist movement decided to do is to expel the Palestinians so that the Jews would become a majority and the dream of a Jewish democracy would not be undermined. There are several mythologies that continue out of that history of 1948, but I do think it's very pivotal. It's a very pivotal event, and rereading that event would explain much better the Palestinian position ever since 1948. Another set of mythologies developed as a result of the June 1967 war. That war created the wrong impression, to which I must say quite a few Palestinians contributed, that actually when we talk about Palestine and when we talk about the Palestinians, we only mean the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and only the people who live in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Why Israelis sponsored such a definition of Palestine and the Palestinians is understandable. Why Americans and Western powers would subscribe to a similar definition is also understandable. But why would Palestinian political leaders do the same is a bit more mysterious. But this is a fact of life. And this kind of redefining what is Palestine and who are the Palestinians was manifested in the Oslo Accord of 1993. Now, it is true that the leader of the PLO at the time, Yasser Arafat, believed, like many other Palestinians, that this is not the end of future negotiations. But to be fair, one should say that in 1993, the PLO in Israel, with the support of the United States and the United Nations, excluded two very important Palestinian groups from any future solution of Israel and Palestine. The Palestinian minority inside Israel, that are about 1.5 million, and the Palestinian refugee communities and exilic communities, which the numbers are debated, but more or less we're talking here about 5 to 6 million people around the Middle East and around the world. Now, I think that if one does not accept that definition, one can see how you can develop a different paradigm of peace, because all the peace efforts since Oslo are based on the idea that if you want to solve the conflict in Israel and Palestine, you have to determine the fate of those areas that Israel occupied in 1967, which are only 20% of Palestine. It's almost, if you ask a physician to treat a patient that has an illness that has spread all over one's body and says, just cure 20% of the body, and hopefully the rest of the 80% would somehow recover. Now, I'm not a medical expert, and I'm sure one or two of you may be and will say to me there are cases like this, so I do apologize for using a metaphor I don't know anything about, but I do believe that in some cases you do have to treat the patient as a whole. I'm sure the Chinese would agree with me at least. I'm not sure about Western medicine and surgeons. This kind of geographical, or rather cartographical, perception of Palestine as being a small part of what it really is, and of the Palestinian population as being a small part of what it is for me one of the major obstacles for peace. I don't think you can really move towards genuine reconciliation and a lasting peace if you do not, first of all, include all the Palestinians and all of what used to be Palestine in a future solution. But I'm facing a very formidable opposition on this. The quartet, that is the United Nations, the USA, Russia, and the EU, by inertia, I think, continue to support this idea, regardless of the facts on the ground that already shown that there is only one state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, which is Israel, that controls the lives of Jews and Arabs alike in different ways. So it's interesting to see how the inertia of diplomatic and political and journalistic discussion of the place has very little relevance to what goes on in the place, as if time has frozen in 1993 and there are no Jewish settlements, there are no Palestinians and Jews living in intertwined communities that would make any separation impossible, and there is no new ideological ideas coming up that really defeat the whole idea of partition. But that, I think, has to do less with mythologies and history and far more with the nature of political life, where you're not trained to think in a strategic way, but only in a tactical way. And it's far better not to rattle the boat for domestic political reasons in the West, but also for global reasons. People do not like to adopt revolutionary ideas about conflicts, but rather hope that the inertia would keep, as political scientists would put it, keep the conflicts on low fire so that it doesn't burn, but not solve it. And this, of course, has proven in history to be a very wrong assumption, because anything which burns on low fire, there always is a wind or a draft that would inflame the fire, and then it might be too late to remember that maybe it was quite good to extinguish the fire when you saw it. Another set of mythologies that stem from Oslo, and I think are bringing us closer to our time, is that the Palestinians, in the words of the former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. This is based on the idea that there were equal partners to the process, and that their proposals for peace, whether before or after Oslo, catered not only to the Israeli national interest, but also to the Palestinian national interest. In fact, that's the tragedy of all the history of the peace process since 1947, since the partition resolution. An old American idea of political science is informing the peace efforts towards Israel and Palestine. That if you want, as an outside negotiator or mediator, to try and help the two warring parties to reach an agreement, you should never take too seriously the point of view of the weaker party. Don't invest any attempt to understand their point of view. Don't regard their point of view as very significant. What you have to do is find out what is the consensual position of the stronger party. In this case, in 1947, the Zionist movement, and after 1948, Israel. So every solution that looked at the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as the territorial space for which you would find the key for solving the conflict in Israel and Palestine was actually a bilateral negotiation with Israel about how far is Israel ready to go in giving the Palestinians something that would satisfy the Israeli national interest, not the Palestinian sense of independence or survival or historical justice. And I'm not saying that it was impossible to find Palestinian leaders who would, for a while, go along with this. But interestingly enough, you don't have many historical examples where such a formidable alliance supported such a clear formula that has so dramatically failed. Almost everybody supports the idea of the two states, and we are not even nearer to that idea with all the might that is behind it. And maybe that's a good moment in history to say, maybe there's something wrong with this paradigm. Maybe this idea that you can all the time only regard the national interest of one side and totally disregard the ambitions, the aspiration of the other side is not the right premise for reconciliation. Maybe the idea that you can allow one side to continue to occupy, to colonize, to expel, to demolish, and at the same time regard that same oppressive side as a legitimate peace partner is also not a fair and good paradigm for peace. Maybe peace is yet not on the agenda. What is on the agenda is the end of oppression, the end of colonization, the end of dispossession. Once dispossession ends, then a genuine peace process can begin. The Palestinians would have an agency as well. They would have to tell the third generation of Jewish settlers how do they see them in a future Israel or Israel and Palestine or whatever would be the name of a new political outfit. But they cannot be asked to elaborate this agency before the oppression and the occupation and the daily abuse of human rights and civil rights has come to an end. And I would leave you with 3 A's, which I think are a very good guidance that I have developed since my involvement as a professional historian, as an activist in the issue of Israel and Palestine. I think there are 3 A's which could serve as a guideline for how to approach a solution. This is not the solution. An individual should never aspire to be so self-important as to offer a solution. I don't offer a solution, but I do offer a guidance in the name not only of myself. I think I represent here a group of Jewish and Palestinian activists and scholars who have been working together on this issue for many, many years. The first A is the A of acknowledgement. We won't be able to move 1 inch in solving the very tense relationship between Jews and Arabs, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, if the Israelis would not acknowledge what they had done to the Palestinians in 1948 and what they had done to the Palestinians ever since 1948. You cannot expel 750,000 Palestinians, which were half of the Palestinian population. You cannot destroy half of the Palestinian villages and towns and not say, I'm sorry. I want to apologize. Apology, of course, is only words, but you know better than I do that words do play an important role in trying to rebuild relationship in countries which have to look boldly at their past. The second A is accountability. Acknowledgement is meaningless if it is not followed by an accountability. Now, there are various ways to be accountable. When Germany wanted to become the new Germany after the Holocaust, it was not enough for the German Chancellor to say, "We are sorry for the Holocaust." They had to be accountable. And their accountability was translated into reparations money, compensation money, support for Israel in diplomacy, in economy. I think in our case study, at least a recognition in the principal right of Palestinians who were expelled to return would be a very good sign that Israel is a different place and really opens up for a better future. And finally, there is the A of acceptance. On this basis, I think, we, the Jews in Israel, have the right to go to the Palestinians, to the neighboring Arab states, even to the Muslim nation, and say, we want to be regarded as acceptable, as legitimate. Let's stop delegitimizing our presence in the midst. We know we are in the midst of the Arab world. We are in the midst of the Muslim world, but we want to be an integral part of its problems and hopefully an integral part of its solutions. This is not impossible. Anybody who studied the history of the Jews in Muslim history or within Muslim empires would know that this is a far better, a far more promising history than the history of the Jews in Europe or the Western world. So let's hope that our zeitgeist is that of a different paradigm for peace and a hopeful solution for this conflict that has raged for too long in such a small country. Thank you very much.
Professor Pappe, thank you very much for that. As I said, as we told our audience in the room prior to the broadcast beginning, we're going to go to our non-media members today. We're going to spread around the room for questions. So I would ask if you could indicate if you'd like a question, put your hand up. We'll have roving microphones on either side of the room coming to you. I would ask, though, that when we do come to you, that you restrict yourself simply to a question. We don't need to background that question in any great detail because we want to get through as many questions as we can. I will start, nonetheless, with a couple of questions before I do, in fact, invite that. So I will be looking for hands to go up around the room. If not, well, then I'll keep asking questions and we'll come to our head media table as well. I see one at table 16. We'll start there, and I'll indicate as I go along, and then I'll come down to table 12. But not now. I'll be coming to you in about 3 or 4 minutes. Thank you very much. Then I'll come down to table 12 after that. So let me write that down, table 16 and 12. Now, let me start with a question about an issue that you really haven't touched on. How concerned are you about the likelihood of conflict at the moment between Iran and Israel? The Israeli military, as I understand it, is not in favour of this, but the Israeli leadership seems to be, and it's certainly building up to what looks like a flashpoint, particularly because of fears over Iran's potential nuclear capability.
Yes, I'm very concerned because you always know how you enter a war, you never know how to get out of it. I must say that much of what the present Israeli Prime Minister and Minister of Defense are doing reminds me of the Egyptian leader's Jamal Abdel Nasser behavior on the eve of the June '67 war. It's called embrinkmanship. It's a kind of policy in which you believe that you can almost play with war and not go to war, and you disregard the fact that you are not the only actor in this game. And maybe you think that what you have done is not war yet, but it could be perceived by the other side already as the beginning of the war. Luckily for us, for instance, the assassination of Iranian scientists did not cause the Iranians to ask their allies in Lebanon to start a war against Israel. But this could have happened. I don't know exactly what is the next Israeli plan. And I'm sure that there is a perception in Israel that you can have such a limited operation that hopefully would discourage the Iranians from retaliating in a way that would drag the whole Middle East into war. But I would not base my hopes on such an assumption. So I'm greatly worried. Now, you made a good point about the Israeli military and security professionals who are totally against it. But I must remind you, as an historian, that most of the Israeli generals and security people advised Menachem Begin in 1982 not to occupy Lebanon. And he totally disregarded their advice. And Netanyahu is or Begin rather, is the ideological father of Benjamin Netanyahu.
There is a feeling that at the moment Israel stands alone. That is within Israel, as I understand it, because it's not receiving the level of US support for action against Iran that it believes should occur. However, there's equally a feeling that should Mitt Romney win the presidential election, there might well be a shift. Do you see, how do you see the sort of respective relevance of those two leaders downstream in relation to this whole issue?
Yes. I think that the main perception in Israel is that the United States as a political power is made out of two dimensions or two levels. One is the executive level of the presidency, where Israel is losing its ability to impact American policy onto a position that would tally with the Israeli political interests. But there is another level, that of Capitol Hill, where the Israelis feel that they have total control. So I think this is a fair analysis. I mean, I hope it will change. But in many ways, I think that the job determines your policy. So I think Mitt Romney is a far more valuable asset to Israel outside the White House than inside the White House. And the Israeli real sort of reliance on American support is not really about having a good president or a bad president, by maintaining the kind of pressure that they have through Capitol Hill. That's why so many of Netanyahu's own advisors do not understand why he chooses to interfere so bluntly and uncharacteristically to past Israeli politician in the American electoral campaign.
Just one final question that I'll come to the floor. For someone who has never visited Israel and who has Jewish friends, but beyond that, and a Jewish grandfather, as it turns out, but beyond that, doesn't have a great understanding of these things, how significant is the sort of Holocaust mentality in terms of as a reference point, in terms of the Israeli psyche?
I think it plays a very important role, objectively, of course, because it was a horrific, traumatic event, but also because it is constantly manipulated. And for me, the most destructive aspect of the manipulation of the Holocaust memory in Israel is the clear association that is being made between what the Nazis did to the Jews and what the Palestinians represent. In fact, every way you look at it in Israel, if it's the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, the educational system, the way that the Holocaust is memorized in schools, there is a clear connection between the Nazis and the Palestinians. Namely, you don't want it to happen again because you're facing another potential destructor. And I think this is really corrupting the soul of the Israeli Jews in a way that not only makes peace impossible, but really does not allow for a normal society to develop and prosper.
I'll take a question now from table 16. I presume the microphone's with you. If you could just keep your question short. Then we'll come to table 12. Do I have any other questions at this stage? Then I'll come down to the two tables here, 9 and 2. Thank you. So table 16, table 12, table 9 after that.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Huda Al-Tamimi. I am from...
The microphone just a little close to your mouth, please.
My name is Huda Al-Tamimi. I am from the Center for Arab and Islamic Study from the Australian National University. My question to Professor Pappe is regarding where do you see the conflict in 5 years' time?
Okay. You probably know that historians predict the past, which is bad enough. And you ask us to predict the future, which is quite frightening. I'm afraid that the time frame you have given us, 5 years, is not long enough, to my mind, for anything too dramatic to happen. I mean, I think things would be the same but a bit worse within the next 5 years, provided, of course, we take into account the possibility of a war in Iran, and that, of course, can shape things even more dramatically. But if I may just, in one sentence, take it a bit longer than 5 years. I'm both an historian and an activist, so I don't allow myself to look back 5 years or to look ahead for 5 years. I need wider spaces of time. I think that in the long run you will have a clear Western position that will not tolerate Israeli policies. You will have an Arab world which will be far less complacent and indifferent to what goes on in Palestine. And you'll have a young Palestinian society far more assertive and far more ready to go on popular resistance. I'm not sure it will happen in 5 years or 6 years. And the Israelis would have to answer some very tough questions about their identity and future, which I don't think they would have to do in the next 5 years. But within 10 years, they would have to do that, in my mind.
Question now from table 12.
Faye Waddington from Just Peace for Palestine in Queensland. What's your opinion of the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign?
Yes, thank you. Of course, for an Israeli Jew to decide to support morally, which I do, the idea of boycott, divestment and sanction is a very difficult decision to take. It's one of the most difficult decisions I've taken in my life. When I was asked to support it, of course, I could not boycott myself. I mean, that wouldn't mean much. People ask me, do you support other people doing that? I really believe that time is running out for both Jews and Arabs in Israel and Palestine. And what needs to be done is a very strong pressure on Israel to stop the kinds of policies that don't even open the chance for peace. And that kind of pressure can only be translated into actions which are familiar to us from the non-violent means that were used in the past in the cases of regimes such as apartheid South Africa. So I do think that in general the idea of boycott, divestment and sanction is a legitimate, I don't know if it's effective, I hope it will be an effective way of sending a message to the Israelis that something very fundamental in their attitude has to change for both their sake and the sake of the Palestinians.
Table 9, then we'll come to table 2.
Thank you. My name is Sylvia Hale. I'm a former member of the New South Wales Parliament. In much of the discourse underlining the discussion of Israeli-Palestine issues in this country, there are three self-evident truths. One, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Two, that Palestinians are aggressive and violent terrorists who need to be suppressed. And three, that critics such as yourself are self-hating Jews. Would you like to comment upon those perceptions?
Yes, definitely. I would start with the last one because I find it very attractive, the idea that I self-hate myself. Now, according to my wife, I actually suffer from the other complex. She thinks I'm too much in love with myself, on the border of being narcissists. I think it's Jews who call other Jews self-hating Jew, and usually it's only Jews who call other Jews self-hating Jews, do it because they don't like themselves. I think they feel very bad in being staunch supporters of, after all, a political state that on a daily basis abuses someone else's rights, most elementary rights, and this is in the name of being the representative of the victims of the Holocaust. So I think a self-hating Jew is something that belongs to those who accuse others. I never had a problem either with my Jewishness or with myself as such, apart from various junctures. The first assumption that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, I think, does not tally the facts on the ground. Until 1967, Israel imposed military rule on 20% of the population, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Military rule means that these citizens have had no basic human rights or civil rights. If 20% of the population by law is not entitled to any right, you cannot call a country a democracy. Since 1967, that same regime is imposed on the Palestinians in the West Bank and until recently on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. A democracy cannot be a country that for more than 45 years does not grant even the most elementary human and civil rights to the Palestinians. So I think one should redefine Israel. It's not a democracy, it's an ethnic state that plays sometimes the democratic game, but unfortunately there is a kind of fatigue in Israel now, and even that game is not play. Deterrorizing the Palestinian is also an important issue. That was your second point. And I think that for some reason, even in the intellectual milieu, when liberation movements or people who are involved in liberation movements are Christians, white and secular, then it's a legitimate resistance. When they seem to be Muslims, then it becomes terror, or Arabs. I think that Arabs and Muslims are as human as any other group of people in the world, and when they resist oppression, they resist oppression. They're not terrorists. That doesn't mean that terrorism was not used by both sides, the state and its opponents, and hopefully non-violent would be the name of the game in the next 10 years, but I think these mythologies have to be debunked.
I'm going to come to table 2 in a moment. Then I think we've got table 11, and then someone from table 13 has indicated they'd like a question. But let me just pick up on this point in terms of, I mean, you are a pariah in your own country, it would seem. And we had a brief discussion about this over lunch previously. It seems to me that if you had simply analysed these documents and reported what they indicated without describing the actions in the way that you did as ethnic cleansing, then perhaps you would not find yourself in the position that you find yourself in today. I'm not saying that you should have pulled your punches, but I just wonder whether that is the critical point in terms of the negative reaction to your whole analysis.
I agree. I don't think the debate in Israel between people like me and most of the society is a factual debate. It's a moral debate. I think that going into a village in 1948 and expelling everyone who lived there is immoral. And no reason in the world would justify such an act. Most of the Israeli Jews would say, our knowledge or our fear that they would have done the same to us justify what we did. I don't accept it. Especially I don't accept it if the whole idea of the Jewish state was conceived by the Western world in order to atone for the Holocaust. That definitely is not the way to say, here is how we universally memorize one of the worst genocides, and here is how we're going to stop the next genocide, by dispossessing the Palestinians. This is unacceptable philosophically, morally, and also ideologically.
I'll come to the question out the front. Thank you.
Rima Alauddin, Ambassador of Jordan to Australia. In the last 21 months, we have witnessed historical events shaping the Northern Africa and the Middle East. How immune, or otherwise not, is Israel to its ramifications? Thank you.
I alluded to it either in an answer, I don't remember, or in my own talk, but I think it's a good point. I think there is a great anxiety in Israel. On two main levels. Of course, there are others, but I don't have the time to develop it, unfortunately. One is that the possibility of democratization of the Arab world really would undermine whatever remains of Israel's ability to sell itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. And hence, whatever remains of the moral support, not just the political support, of the moral support that Israel receives may be further eroded in such a development. And this cartographic image of Israel as being a sea of progress an island of progress in a sea of barbarity would be replaced by a sea of progress with quite a fanatic island made of Jewish settlers in it. The second worry is that for them, and I think this for me is not a worry, I think this would be a positive development, be it a very complex one, is that Pan-Arabism in a new kind of form, a 21st century version of Pan-Arabism with Palestine as its core can develop in a way that would make the region far more involved and active on the question of the fate of Israel and Palestine. The Israelis have succeeded in various ways of taming any regional interference in a high level on the issue of Israel and Palestine. This, I think, can change if there is a fundamental transformation in the nature of the Arab nation states and in the right of the societies to take a more active role in shaping the policies of the governments.
A question now from table 11, then we'll come to 13.
Good afternoon. My name's Claire Doherty. I'm from the Canberra branch of Australians for Justice and Peace in Palestine. My question to you is about the role of the Jordan River in peace negotiations. I understand that Israel controls over 80% of the Jordan River's flows and its groundwater, and I'd just like to know your thoughts on whether you think this is a sustainable way to maintain relations in the area. Thank you. Yes,
the question was listened to quite intently by the ambassador, I have to say.
I think it's more than just the Jordan River. I think if one should take this opportunity, given you a very good question, to say something about water policy altogether. I think one of the less known means by which Israel oppresses the Palestinians and really disregards the interests of other people in the Middle East is the issue of water. The Israelis are very water-minded society. I think that has to do a lot with our psyche as European settlers. We never liked the desert, the aridness, and we somehow thought we could Europeanize the desert. From the age of 3, I remember in kindergarten, you would think about how brilliantly Israel bloomed the desert. And it's only when I visited the desert for the first time I understood that it's totally stupid to bloom the desert. But nevertheless, this was done. And then they brought European pine trees that need a lot of water in order to take over the more Arab landscape. And I think part of it is behind their policies. But the other side of this is that Palestinians are getting less and less water, and neighboring Arab states are getting less and less water. And I do feel that a different ideological infrastructure of the Jewish state would also change policies on the issue of water.
I'll take a question from 13, I'll come to 9, then down to the table 4 in front of me here.
My name's Robert Howell, I'm from Quakers Australia. What can Australians realistically do? What would you like them to do?
Right. Well, I think that I always say that at least Australians who are not part of the decision-making policy have a different role for those who have hopefully a role in shaping policies. For the society at large, I always ask them to be VIPs, to visit, inform and protest. I think that's very important, not to let the Palestinians think that they have been forgotten, even if Australia seems to be quite far away, as I noticed flying over here, from the rest of us. And I think it's very, very important. But I think far more important is, given the role Australia played in 1947, is to take some responsibility for what happened there. You don't have the same responsibility as Britain had or the United States, but there is an Australian responsibility there. And I think a clear message from Australian policymakers, academics, and journalists that A, they know exactly what goes on the ground, and a place where children are being arrested without trial and houses are being demolished on a daily basis is not something that escaped your attention, nor your rebuke. So you can start with small things, protesting against the colonization policy in the West Bank, and hopefully move on to even a more fundamental position of what is just, what would be a just solution for Israel and Palestine.
A question now from table 9.
Ilan, thank you very much for your great lecture. Peter Manning, journalist and academic. I'd be interested in your take on Western journalists and how they transmit the mythologies that you talked about or have deconstructed them. You're going to give the Edward Said lecture pretty soon in Adelaide. Right. His famous book on Orientalism is relevant. And I'm interested in whether you think that the Palestinian narrative opposing those mythologies gets a fair go.
Yes, I think it's a fair question. And there is an interesting geographical take on this. Since the late 1940s and until today, most Western journalists use Jerusalem as a base for two things. One, to report about the Israeli-Palestinian reality, and they hardly move out of a certain quarter you and I know in Jerusalem, and they don't really see with their own eyes what is not that far away from there. Sometimes they do see it, but they don't choose to report it. One of the extenuating circumstances, or one of the excuses one can make for them, that what they see is not dramatically cruel. It's on a daily basis. These are minor cruelties on a daily basis. And actually, to understand their significance, you have to provide an accumulative report. You have to be an academic, not just a journalist. And that maybe runs against the nature of journalistic report, because you have to report what you have seen yesterday. You can't sort of say, in the last year, actually what I've seen amounts to a crime against humanity, which is what's happening on the ground. So they're not doing that for reasons I've tried to explain. But more interestingly, in a way, less maybe relevant, but it's very interesting, I don't know if you noticed, that at least most Western journalists, not all of them, are using Jerusalem as a base for which to report what goes on in Egypt, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon. Israel, using Edward Said's ideas, is not just a Western bastion in their eyes. It's an Orientalist state. It is the state that explains the Orient to the rest of the West. Yeah.
I'll take a question from table 4, then come back for a final question from the head table.
Mohammed Mashni, Australians for Palestine in Melbourne. Thank you for an outstanding historical lesson today. Given we're in the nation's capital and the decision makers are just up the road, what specific ask would you have for our nation's leaders on this topic?
Right. I think that, to be modest in a request, I think a change of language would be very welcome. I think any beginning of conversation that leaders can have on the Palestine issue whenever it emerges, that would at least indicate to the Palestinians that their concerns and interests are being taken into account, would be very welcome. This has never happened in Australia. I really followed carefully what your foreign ministers have been saying and your prime ministers have said, and there is never even a modicum of sympathy to the oppression. At least President Obama, I'll give you an example, not that it's obviously from his example we see that this is not enough, but it's a good beginning. Obama's speech in the American University in Cairo indicated a template of how at least Western leaders could begin to talk a bit differently on Israel and Palestine. That would be very welcome. It doesn't cost much, and I don't think they would lose the next election just because of that. Secondly, of course, I would have hoped a more benign attitude towards basic Palestinian initiatives, and I would focus on UNESCO. The Palestinian wish to recognize Palestine as Palestine is not such an unbearable idea, and yet I followed the Australian position on it. It's even harsher than Israel on this issue, so it's time to change it.
And a question now from the President of the International Association of Press Clubs, Ken Randall.
Thank you, Laurie. I'd like to ask you a bit more about American politics. I thought the video that was released this week about Mitt Romney's speech, in which he touched on this issue, was quite extraordinary when he just said the sort of outcome that people look for is impossible, just kick it down the field and see what happens, is totally dismissive. What sort of, given the fact that many of us think that American Jewish community support really props up the state of Israel, what sort of political impact do you think that will have? And if that's not the one, in this next question. What is your most dangerous idea for the opening of the festival at the Opera House next weekend?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let me start with the first issue. I think that one has to understand that American support for Israel is really based on a triangle that has sort of three legs to it. One leg is Christian Zionism. In fact, this is the oldest leg that informs American policy. People tend to forget how crucial Christian Zionism is in the life of American politics. Their conservative estimates of their numbers are 5 or 6 times more than the number of Jews who support pro-Israeli policies by the United States. It's a very formidable source. It is amusing in a way that Israelis rely so much on Christian Zionists who, after all, have these perceptions of the second coming of the Messiah that would be followed by barbecuing Jews if they don't convert to Christianity. But that's part of the Israelis' psychic problems. The other leg is the Jewish lobby, of course, that was built in the days of President Truman, which is a very interesting historical period to go for in order to understand American policy, because, not Truman, I'm sorry, President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower changed the American policy towards Israel and Palestine. He was about to pressure Israel to allow the return of the refugees, which really have enhanced enormously the chances of peace in Israel and Palestine. And he was in many ways rejected by the creation of the Jewish lobby. But I think the Jewish lobby power has really petered out in many ways, because the younger generation of Jews, for very egotistic reasons, do not feel committed or do not think that part of their identity connects necessarily to Israel. They feel very, very American. The third leg is the leg of the military-industrial complex that has its own agenda. And even there I can see changes. I don't think Israel is anymore such a great industrial or military asset, given the other options that the Arab world is offering. So I think much of what remains is Christian Zionism, to which I know that Mitt Romney is a Mormon and not the Christian Zionist, but he behaves as one, is part of that chapter in American history, which I don't think will continue for too long. I'm in a very optimistic mood today. The food was excellent. Your second question, I think the most dangerous idea an Israeli Jew can put forward is that a wish to see Israel as a genuine democracy. This is very dangerous to anyone who is a Zionist. And they really regard this as tantamount to suicide if Israel would become a genuine democracy. I think this is not dangerous. I think this is really the only hope for everyone who lived there and used to live there. Thank you.
Please put your hands together.